SABC News presentation.
Welcome to Interface. My name is Termination. Your right to communicate may be under threat. ICASA and the two cell phone giants, MTN and Vodacom, are bickering over mobile termination rates. The cell phone operators are aggrieved over the revised termination rates and they have taken ICASA to court. ICASA says the reduced rates are meant to cut the cost of communication and also help smaller operators. Now on Interface this evening we ask, is the cost to communicate too high in South Africa? Is ICASA meddling in what should be an open, competitive market? Our guest is Dr. Dale McKinley, who is from the Right to Know campaign. And as you know, you can join the conversation by logging onto our Facebook page. Like our page, it's Interface on SABC3, and we can continue the conversation there. And also you can find me on Twitter, it's @Termination. And just to make a note, before we introduce you, Dale, just to make a note that we did invite the mobile operators, MTN, Vodacom, Cell C, and we also invited Telkom, and they all declined to participate. So it's not as though we're talking about them without giving them a chance to talk to us. But welcome. Thank you for joining us here today. Now, let's start with this perception that costs of communication in South Africa are very high. We spoke to the Minister of Communications last week on the program, and that was the general sentiment. Do you agree with that? Are we paying too much to communicate?
Absolutely. All of the research that has been done over the last several years would indicate that South Africa is among some of the highest call rates in the world.
Why is that?
Well, it's because of lack of regulation and lack of competition. If you think about it, from the very beginning after 1994, when the two, MTN and Vodacom, the two largest cell phone operators there was no one else. They had it all pretty much to themselves. And we can talk about their own support from government that they received. They're being quite hypocritical now in turning around 15, 20 years later and claiming the government's trying to help their competitors. But essentially there was no competition, and ICASA basically left it up to the mobile operators to determine the rates and determine everything. And they, of course, what they do, they put them up. And so
by about 500%,
500%
at some point.
Yes, and texting messages making 3,000% profit on one text. So essentially there was nobody to tell them you can't do this. ICASA is now, fortunately, I think, beginning to take their role seriously, which is to regulate the industry and to bring the pricing down. And the first now serious move, these interconnection rates, we see what happens, and MTN and Vodacom are now fighting it in court.
And in your view, has ICASA woken up too late? Why are they only now, 15, 20 years down the line, starting to do something about this?
Well, I think it's a good sign of the health of our democracy. They are responding to public pressure. They're responding to political pressure. This has become an issue for people now in the last several years. Not only the Right to Know campaign, but many other players in civil society have said, this is too high. We need a proper regulation. And ICASA and the ANC as the ruling party, I think, have heard that message to a certain degree and are beginning to act on it. I would say that they're probably acting a little bit more hurriedly in the context of upcoming elections as well. But in the case, it's a good development that is happening finally.
So just from a consumer perspective, a layman's perspective, if you are lowering the termination rates, what does that mean to me? Because all I want to know is it going to be cheaper when I make that call, when I send that SMS? Am I going to pay less, or is this got nothing to do with me as a consumer?
No, it does have something to do with you. Basically, what the mobile termination rates are is the charges that each cell phone operator charges when they connect to another network outside of their own. So you're calling from a Vodacom number to a Cell C number or to an MTN number. It's the charge that is put on top of the call time charges. So yes, if it's brought down, it will clearly bring down some of the charges with regards to if you talk for 5 minutes or however long it is, but it's minimal. We're not talking about... I was going to
say, what percentages are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about a 50%, ICASA's proposal is a 50% reduction in the call rate from about 44 cents a minute to about 20 cents a minute. But in other countries where MTN and Vodacom operate in the rest of the continent, it's below 10 cents. for a minute. So we have a situation where South Africans actually have been for a number of years paying much, much higher rates and subsidizing MTN and Vodacom's operations as they expand into the rest of the continent.
Some would say that's a brilliant business strategy. Take your cash cow and make them pay for all the other growth strategies.
Well, as a corporation, it certainly makes sense. But for the user in South Africa, it doesn't, obviously. What we believe, we've been taken for a ride. We believe that MTN and Vodacom have basically done exactly what they would do without any regulation, which is ramp up the prices and charge us outrageous amounts of money as long as they can get away with it. Now that ICASA is telling them, wait a minute, you have to lower this, they're adopting a very aggressive attitude and saying that's going to make us less competitive. You're supporting our competition and everything else, when they themselves received exactly the same preferential treatment when they were starting up their networks in the 1990s.
But let's look at it from a purely business perspective here, not the consumer perspective. If you are a mobile cell phone operator and you've been doing very well for X number of years, you have been paying dividends to your shareholders at a certain level, you have got debts up to wherever, you've got bills to pay, you've got, you've got money that you need that in a standard that you've set. So now, when your rates or your termination rates are cut by 50%, surely that's going to affect your bottom line. So you should be complaining about it.
Well, it's going to affect your bottom line, but we live in a country in which we don't have a situation where companies can make as much money they want to and do whatever they want. We're supposed to be a developmental society. Communication is a right in our Constitution. And in that context, what we're saying is, do we just have, your question at the beginning, a totally free and open market where corporations can basically charge us what they want and the few shareholders are going to get those profits? Or do we have a social situation where the social compact between the user and the company itself says, look, we need to make a profit, sure, we need to do that, but we're going to do it in the context of spreading telephony and telecommunications to the majority of the population who cannot afford it. That is what the ruling party says we're all about. This is what South Africa, we are not a country which says basically, charge whatever you want, it's not a problem, get as much profit as you want.
And the view that government or the state is starting to meddle too much in what should be a free and open market, you don't agree with that view. So well, some are saying in mining it's starting to happen. Now you're going to see it in telecoms where you've got a regulator telling us exactly what we should and should not charge.
Well, the MTN and Vodacom are being hypocrites. This is the problem with corporate capital. When it's in trouble, it runs to the state. When banks are in trouble, where do they run to? The public purse. They get bailed out. When MTN and Vodacom were starting up theirs, Telkom gave them over 50 billion rand in subsidies to start up their networks and their infrastructure. Did they complain that the state was interfering in the market? No. They said, thank you very much. That's an error. But as soon as the state, later on, 15 years, tries to intervene to pull that down to make a benefit, they start complaining that it's state interference. They can't have it both ways.
So we've got to take a short break. I would love to get your thoughts on this. Remember that you can find us on our Facebook page. It's Interface on SABC3 and also on Twitter at Thembisa Magele. I'd love to know what you think of what is happening in the telecom space. So do stay with us. So we're in conversation with Dr. Dale McKinley, who is with the Right to Know campaign. And during the break, we were just talking about how in filing court papers, MTN and Vodacom have said that the state, and ICASA in particular, have been unfair in the way that they've treated them in this. You disagree?
Well, it's not just that I disagree. It's a factual issue because in the last 10 years, ICASA has not intervened to drop these termination rates, nor have they really intervened to drop most call rates. So we've had a decade over which MTN and Vodacom have been just basically having a great party at our expense. And now that they come in, it's not an unfair, it's a correction. It's essentially saying, you've been having this great time at the expense of the consumer, now we're going to go into and do what we're supposed to do. ICASA's job is to regulate the industry in the benefit of the consumer. If we're going to say that ICASA shouldn't exist, well then we should just let MTN and Vodacom charge whatever they want.
Okay, now let's turn our attention to the smaller operators here, because we've seen them go to town, particularly with advertising that suggests that, you know, they are the champions of our right to communicate. We've seen Cell C do this on radio and on TV. We've seen Telkom taking out full-page ads in newspapers saying, you know, MTN and Vodacom are not interested in your right to communicate. We are. That's surely a little bit cheeky on their part, but not entirely correct.
It is cheeky. It's a bit opportunistic, actually, because they've been silent for the last 15 years while they've been making lots of money. And all of a sudden, now that there's public pressure, now that there's a public campaign, now that politicians, the minister and others are responding to that pressure, which they should in a democracy, all of a sudden, I'm sure the PR departments and all of the cell phone companies are saying, oh, we've got to get on the right side here. So, of course, you see Cell C. We are the champion. We're behind you as the people. The point I wanted to make to Cell C, if they had been here, was that they say, we support your fundamental right to communicate. Well, the point is that if we have fundamental rights in our Constitution, a fundamental right is not dependent upon how much you can pay. So if it's a fundamental right, then it's a fundamental right. And the cell phone companies have got to understand that they operate in a country with historic divisions and with an entire population that has essentially been left out of this technological revolution. If we want to bring kids in Limpopo and in Northern Cape into that, then we're going to have to lower those costs and make data, internet, call rates really, really affordable for people. Then we can talk about a technological revolution in education and other things. This is not simply a profit business question, it's a developmental issue.
I get that. So now you've got your Cell C and your Telkom saying, now that we're being given a chance here, what we're going to do is we're going to pass this on to the consumer. We're going to make sure that the consumer is paying less. But where's the guarantee in that? Because they could very well be paying off their debts and doing other things, bumping up the profits to their own shareholders. There's no guarantee that actually this will be passed on to consumers.
Absolutely. And the problem there is that as the Right to Know campaign, we've asked all three operators to provide us with information on how they spend their profits and where they're doing their infrastructure and exactly how they're basically subsidizing and cross-subsidizing so to benefit the consumer. They refuse. Every single one of them refuses to provide.
Including the smaller operators.
Including Cell C. We marched on Cell C last year and said, please give us your plans. They refused. So the question I had to all the operators is, what do you have to hide? If you're saying you're behind the people, if you're saying you're going to drop these termination rates, then open the books and tell us exactly how you're spending the money and where it's going. But they refuse to do that. The question is why? And we are posing that question to you, Cell C, Vodacom, MTN, and all the rest of you. If you are watching, we did invite you, but you declined to come on, but we would still like to get your views on this particular matter. But now, when it comes to what is being lowered now, we said in the beginning it's just the termination rates. When are we getting to data rates? When are we getting to voice? When are we getting to the things that actually really matter for the consumer? It's a good question. We're saying these things need to be put on the agenda now. That ICASA needs to not just, it's a good start, mobile termination rates, but let's look at bringing down the costs of actually the things that people use every day, which is data and call time. And that has not been yet put onto the agenda. So we're basically, this campaign is going to have to push ICASA and the government to go further than they have. Yes, we welcome this as a good start, but it will stall and it will not have much of an impact on the overall cost of communications if it remains exactly at this point.
One of the operators, MTN, has come out to say that if this goes ahead, there will be job losses. And that's a very big threat in a country where there's so much unemployment.
Well, I would say to MTN and Vodacom as well is that this is the standard response of all corporations when they're faced with a little bit of a loss of their profit. So when miners strike for a better wage, what do you hear lawnmen and them saying? There's going to be job retrenchments and we're going to go elsewhere and we can't invest. It's always the same threat that corporations use. Corporations must understand that they inhabit a country in which they cannot just simply do what they want to do. They have to become part of the game here. They've got to become part of a social compact in which their own employees and which people. So I think it's an empty threat. The fact is that MTN and Vodacom, if you look at their books and their profit, they've been making lots of money over the last 10 years.
And that's why they are investing. That's what businesses
Precisely.
do. So if you're going to start messing with their profits as a country, as a state, why would they want to stick around? Why would they want to continue to invest in a country that does that? It's a relative question.
For example, when you say mess with their profits, if you've been making an average of 40 to 45% profit over the last several years, and your profit's going to drop to 42% as a result of a mobile, 3% less profit, we're going to go elsewhere. Well, where are you going to get that kind of profit range? Of course, it's an empty threat. It's a game that's being played. The fact is that they're making money. No one's contesting that. It's a question of how much money and at whose expense you're going to make it. Those are legitimate questions in a context of a South Africa that is still trying to deal with the legacies of apartheid and with massive inequalities in our country.
Here's something that's been a little bit confusing to me. On the one hand, you've got these letters that we spoke about being taken out in newspapers by the CEO of Telkom saying, you know, you MTN and you Vodacom are standing in the way of cheaper communication in South Africa. And yet, there's a deal that's been struck between MTN and Telkom.
Telkom, yes.
So where does that fit into the puzzle?
I think it's the competitors playing. They listen. This is a PR game as well. They want to get on top of the board while things are a little bit uneven, or let's say unpredictable at the moment. So Telkom's entering the fray now, and while it's saying one thing with its one side of its mouth, it's obviously then dealing with MTN on the other side. So it's going to. The fact is that in the advertising and the battle for public opinion, all of these companies are going to try to say that we're on your side, that we're the ones that you should, because if people then go to them, if they sign up with ATOF, if they sign up with CELC, they're going to make more money, they're going to have more clients. So it's an advertising war at the same time, which I think is a totally separate issue from what the real issues are.
Advertising aside, what is the value for the consumer in this potential deal between MTN and Telkom? What is this about? How is this going to benefit us?
I'm not aware of the specifics of the agreement, but I would imagine that the potential value would be a further drop in interconnection of people who are on fixed landlines versus calling cell phones, because Telkom dominates the fixed landline market in this country, and that has been a gripe of a lot of the, using the infrastructure of Telkom and Centec as well. So maybe there's deals there that lower those rates and access to that infrastructure that would then lower some of the costs. I would imagine that would be the benefit that could come out of that deal.
But looking at what's going on globally with telecoms, I mean, just the other day there was an announcement that Facebook had acquired WhatsApp.
That's right.
Now that will mean that, people are going to turn to texting for free rather than making the calls and paying for data. Now, how is that likely to change the landscape in South Africa?
Well, I think it will change the landscape for those that have access to those devices. You remember, you have to have a smartphone in order to be able to get onto the internet.
And most people do.
And not a lot of people in the rural areas are having the money to pay to get the data on a smartphone. They might have the infrastructure. So we have the smartphone, but you have to, if you're going to spend 10 or 15 minutes on, you're going to pay for that. And most people don't have that kind of money to spend a lot of time surfing the internet and chatting with their friends and everything else. So I think what it is, it will immediately impact on the middle classes and those that have access to the technology. It'll make it, and the cell phone companies are going to have to respond to that because it's competition. If you can do a free call on WhatsApp or whatever the other platforms, it'll have to make, so they're going to have to become much more creative, and they're going to have to lower their costs.
I want us to talk a little bit about what their responses should be, particularly in this very uncertain climate in South Africa when it comes to telecoms. But we have to take another short break. We're back after this. So if you want to find us on Facebook, it's Interface on SABC3, and Wanki Muerane did. She found us on Facebook, liked our page, and told us about how she terminated her contract with Vodacom back in 2009. A couple of you have said that you have terminated your contracts with these cell phone companies. John Lackhoff says, the call rates in Nigeria are far less than in South Africa. Their reason is that Nigeria has a bigger market. And I'm sure that ties in with your point earlier, Dale, about South Africa subsidizing other African countries. And Vasta Jr. says, I think we must start complaining because we have been too silent about mobile operators doing evil things to us for far too long. Now, that brings me to this point. South Africans generally, by and large, are seen as a nation of people who just roll over and play dead. So somebody takes money from us, makes us pay this much, we grumble a little bit, but we don't do anything about it. There's no activism, consumer activism, per se, in this country. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would certainly say that we have a history of political activism.
Political, yes.
Consumer activism, I would agree. Sometimes I think we accept very low standards. That we are, as you say, prone to complain but not do much about it. But I think that's changing. I think in the last several years we have consumer civil society bodies that have been doing a very good job alerting people about everything from what we're eating to the bad labeling or whatever. So I think it's gaining, and I think more and more of our citizenry are beginning to understand and say, look, if we're going to pay these things, then we need to know what we're paying for, and we need to basically have that information. That's what the Right to Know campaign is about, in that sense, is that if people don't know, then they can't be active in the context. So information is knowledge, knowledge is power.
So we are becoming more active.
I think we are becoming more active, and I think that this example of ICASA and the government responding to the public pressure is a good example of where that can go. They're beginning to feel, and when political parties rightfully feel public pressure, they need to act accordingly and to listen to what people are saying. And Vodacom and MTN might not like it, but that's the price you pay for living in a democracy.
And last week, the minister spoke a little bit about the public hearings that are now open for people to come and make comments on the integrated ICT strategy and all of that. What do you think we should be doing to try and make sure that our voices are heard there, but also to make the right points to make sure that there's access, universal access for everybody in South Africa?
Well, we were there at that ICT ministerial conference just the other week here in Gauteng, and it's a good opportunity to have people have their say. And these public participation processes that I think are becoming more taken more seriously by government, I believe, in some ways. People must, whether it's in a community hall, whether it's at the expert NGO level or whatever, say what they feel. And they must then put that behind their political support for those that they're voting for.
I was going to say, does it really matter? Because sometimes people feel that they go out there, they have their say, and you know, the government or business or whoever it is that's calling these public hearings is going to go ahead and do what they want anyway.
Well, I think that that's a fairly fatalistic attitude, because if we had that, we thought we would say we couldn't change anything.
Sure.
But clearly we can change things. When we're active, when our voices are heard, when we use the institutional frameworks, but sometimes on the streets as well, I think the government has to respond to that, and it has. We haven't remained static as a country in 20 years. Things have shifted, things have changed, and I think on the consumer front, and particularly, and this is not simply a consumer issue, it's, as we say, a developmental issue. Communication is fundamentally important, and I think people are beginning to realize that more and more.
Now, going forward, we've had this application being lodged in court, and that effectively means that this whole termination rate issue is going to be on hold until that's sorted, right?
That is our understanding, is once it's in the court system, they can't implement it until the ruling is made. That's correct.
And how long can we anticipate that that's going to
go
for?
I understand that should be within the next 2 months that the decision is made. So I would imagine by April or May we should have a situation. But ICASA has said they're going to move in this direction irregardless of what happens in this court case in terms of regulate, which I think is a positive move.
But can they do that?
Yeah, of course they can. They have.
But how do they do that if there's a court case pending?
Well, if there's a court case, the court case pending will decide that maybe, you know, hopefully it won't decide that these termination rates are illegal, because they're not necessarily. It's a question of how much they are. But ICASA can first of all fight that in the courts. But at the same time, they can look at all sorts of other measures to lower costs. Termination rates are only one. So there might be. And if the MTN and Vodacom want to go into legal battles for the next 3 or 4 years with their own national regulator, then I think they're going to start losing market share. They're going to start losing to their competitor, because they're going to be seen as greedy, as selfish operators that have no interest in their clients and bringing these things down. And they need to listen to their own client base as well. They can't just simply act as if they are a separate entity outside of that. And people are going to vote with their feet or vote with their phones. And that's part of the deal, is if we're going to have a situation in which call rates are going to be brought down, then we need to have proper competition. In this context, we don't need to have a duopoly, which is what we really have, which is two big ones, MTN and Vodacom, who dominate the market, over 80% of it.
Now, what about investments, capital investments that have been made by MTN and Vodacom, all of these obligations that they have? If there is a decrease in these termination rates, will that impact them negatively in terms of their obligations?
No. It will make them have to shift a little bit. They might have to, just like a lot of corporations do in times when you don't expect that your plan goes exactly as you would like it to go. You push certain capital into other areas, you subsidize, you do these things. That's what businesses do. They must be creative. Let me just make a quick point here about this, is that this should really not be a serious debate, because this is the first time in 15 years that the companies have even been forced to drop one aspect of their cost. And here it is, they're outraged. It's the other way around. We should be outraged that we actually have not had much more of this than we've had in the 15 years.
So you're not worried about infrastructure development and all of the plans that these companies have in terms of expanding, not only nationally, but also continentally?
No, I don't think so, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to tell us, by the way, if you just take 40 cents away on we're going to have to stop building infrastructure. It's absolute nonsense. They know that. They know that they can still make plenty of money on doing this thing, and we shouldn't be party to their blackmail.
All right, let's leave it there. Dr. Dale McKinley, thank you so much for coming through to talk to us about this. And just to mention once again that we did invite all of the cell phone operators and also ICASA to come and talk to us about this, but they have declined to come through. But do give us your thoughts. Interface on SABC 3, that's how you find us on Facebook. Let's continue this chat. Until next week, good night.